Thank you. Morning, everyone. Nice to see you. You okay? I'm freezing. If you're cold, we're getting the heating replaced. Hurrah! My hands are actually numb. Anyway, here's an idea for you to think about. I feel very loud. That's not the idea. Am I too loud? Yes, you can say that. That's okay. Just before we get any further. I'm very excited, you see, so I speak very loudly. Caroline's much more gentle and normal than I am. Lovely. Here's the idea I actually want you to think about, not the volume of my voice. The oppressed. Who are they? Do you see them? Do you hear them? Do you know them? People who are denied rights, denied freedoms, denied opportunities. People who are mistreated or exploited, often due to things like race or gender or sexuality or poverty, often experiencing systemic disadvantages, big barriers, challenges, restrictions. The oppressed. Who are they? Who are they in the world? And who are they in England? And who are they in Devon? And who are they in Crediton? Who are they in the street where you live? Who are they in this room? Who are they in your family? Do you see them? Do you hear them? Do you know them? A while ago, I heard this story about, sometimes we're walking along the street and there's volunteers with a clipboard. Do you remember that? You know those people? I heard a story about some of those volunteers stood on busy city streets and they were stopping passers-by to ask them one question. And the question was, how many people do you think slept on the streets here last night? And so people sort of guessed numbers, like a handful, maybe 10 or 20. These in big city streets. And the real number was actually in the hundreds. And just no one guessed anywhere near that. And there's two things that are striking about that story, aren't there? Firstly, the number of people who are currently homeless, which is currently over 380,000 in our country. Not just numbers, but those are real people with real stories and situations. The other thing that is striking about that story is how invisible it was. I imagine that most of those people answering the survey question, how many people do you think slept on the streets here last night? I imagine most of those people weren't deliberately trying to be like heartless or to ignore or pretend something wasn't happening. But they just hadn't seen, just hadn't noticed, hadn't realised. I think one of the greatest dangers when it comes to oppression of any kind is not always the obvious kind of violence or hatred. Very often it's not noticing, not listening, not seeing, which leads to people becoming forgotten. And I was reminded of that story when I read the first few chapters of Exodus. Because that book begins with a people who have been forgotten. Forgotten by those in power, but as we will see, not forgotten by God. So just to put all of this in context this morning, do you remember before Christmas, we started following the story of God's people through the Old Testament? You might remember, anything before Christmas seems too long ago now, doesn't it? But do you remember that? We have looked at Abraham and we've looked at Jacob. And so now we're moving on to look at Moses. And how did God's people end up in this situation? How did they come to be oppressed in the first place? Lots of you will know the story. Back in Genesis, we read Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery. And then if you read that amazing story, God works through all kinds of amazing things in that situation. And saves many, many lives. Joseph rises to power in Egypt. And then during that really awful famine, he brings his brother and his father, all his brothers and his father Jacob with him to safety. And there they are welcomed and they're protected and they're given good land. And Egypt becomes a place of refuge. They thrive. In Exodus chapter 1, it says the words, the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And then there comes a turning point in verse 8, because it says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So Pharaoh's gone, a new king rises up who didn't know Joseph, didn't know the history, didn't know the things Pharaoh knew that caused him to keep Joseph close to him. And everything changes. Fear sets in. The Egyptians see that the Israelites, who are numerous and strong, and they no longer see them as people to be protected. They've become a problem that needs to be managed. And so that fear leads to a need to control the people, and that control leads to oppression. And oppression becomes slavery in this story. They're forced into hard labor, and when that doesn't break them, Pharaoh goes as far as ordering the killing of the Hebrew boys. The Israelites are being oppressed. Here they are in our passage, the oppressed. Do you see them? So by the time we get to Exodus 3, God's people have been enslaved for about 400 years. Like whole generations of people have lived and died without knowing freedom outside of that slavery. Imagine all the prayers that have been offered in that time that just seem unanswered. They're still there, still experiencing that oppression. Hope must have felt so distant. And then we read of this incredible encounter between God and Moses, which is remarkable for many reasons, isn't it? But most notably because God is in a burning bush in the wilderness, which is quite remarkable. And listen to this. Sue read it for us just now. God says to Moses, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out. I'm concerned about their sufferings. Is that good? I have seen them. I have heard them. I am concerned about their sufferings. And in fact, if you get to verse 8, I think it might be one of my new favorite verses. God says something incredible there. He says, so I have come down to rescue them. I think those words matter to us really deeply because they reassure us that God sees and cares. Now, I can't explain to you why there was 400 years there. Can't explain to you why it took so long. I don't have answers for why the people were enslaved for as long as they were. I can't understand why the prayers seemed to be unanswered for so long. And I can't tell you why, even when God says this, even when he says, I have come down to rescue them, the chains don't fall off immediately then. As we read on in Exodus over the next few weeks together, we'll see that things actually get worse before they get better. There's going to be a big struggle with Pharaoh, and all those plagues are yet to come. So that's at least a period of months before Pharaoh eventually lets them go. And in the same way, I don't have good answers for why we see suffering around us today. I don't know why brokenness isn't just restored. I don't know why prayers sometimes feel unanswered. I can't get my head around why the oppressed, whoever we think they are, aren't just delivered into freedom. But this passage does give me hope. It gives me hope that God doesn't forget. God sees, God cares, and so I, with my tiny human brain and my tiny earthly perspective on life, choose to trust. Choose to trust in God's timing. Choose to trust that he is good and he is kind. Choose to trust that his word is true when it says he is at work for our good. Even when It doesn't seem to make sense. Because the God of heaven is not distant. The God of heaven is not detached. He is not unaware. He is not indifferent in the face of injustice. The God of the universe is not content to sit back and watch. He is a God who acts, a God who comes down. And I was really struck this week how much this is a foreshadowing of all that we've just celebrated at Christmas, isn't it? Here I am talking about God coming down to rescue people, and we've just spent the last however many weeks of our lives celebrating that God really came to earth to save me and you. And so I've loved getting stuck into this passage, and I've really been struck at how much it just reveals to us about God and his character. So we get this reminder of God's holiness, the one who is pure, the one who is set apart, the one who is worthy of all praise. God says to Moses, take off your shoes. The place that you are standing is holy ground. Moses, this is not just an ordinary conversation. You are in the presence of holy and almighty God. What a cool reminder of the holiness of God. God also reveals his name. Pretty cool name. Don't know anyone else named it. I am who I am. That's like even above Bond, James Bond, isn't it? What's your name? I am who I am. God who is faithful. God who is not defined by circumstances. God who was and is to come forever. Holy, eternal, and unchanging. The same yesterday, today, and forever. This is our God. I am who I am. And we also get this reminder of the way that this God, who is holy, eternal, unchanging, the same yesterday, today, and forever, I am who I am, loves his children and knows us by name. He doesn't say, "Oi, you, come and take off your shoes." He says, Moses, listen. That's just mind-blowing, isn't it? The God who is all those things, the God of heaven, knows his children by name and says, Moses. So God is holy, he's set apart, almighty, unchanging and eternal. His name, I am who I am, and he knows his children by name. He sees their oppression, he hears the cries of his people, he cares about their situation, and he moves, he acts. He does something to deliver them from their suffering and oppression. And there's more. There's something else in this passage which I think is really significant. We see that God chooses someone like Moses, ordinary people, to be part of his work. Moses, who has messed up plenty of times already. If you read anything before our story today, you will see many opportunities to go, Moses, really? You? And even right now in our story, he is just a shepherd, kind of lowly, lowest of the low vibes. And God says to him, so now go. I am sending you. And fair enough, Moses has a couple of things to say about it. It's a few questions to ask. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God just says to him, I'll be with you. God often chooses people who feel unqualified, too weak, too tired, too young, too old, too whatever. And you know, the deliverance bit, the saving bit, is God's work. But he does invite ordinary people. He invites Moses, he invites us to participate. God does not just simply rescue Israel himself, he chooses to work through a human being. And he doesn't call Moses because of Moses' strength. I just think that's how love works. Love invites participation, cooperation. And we know that as God promised Moses, I will be with you, he says the same to us. So for us today, it's still true that God is at work to deliver the oppressed, to set people free. And it's still true today that he chooses to invite us to be part of it. Not because he needs us, certainly not because we have what is needed for the situations. Individually, we're not called to sort of save the world, but we can be faithful where we are, knowing that he is with us. So, the oppressed, who are they? Who are they in the world, in England, in Devon, in Crediton? Who are they in the street where you live? Who are they in this room or in your family? Do you see them? Do you hear them? Do you know them? People who are marginalised because of difference, because of race, disability, mental health. People who are trapped in cycles of poverty with no realistic way out. People who are victims of modern slavery, human trafficking, exploitation. People who are displaced, people who are refugees. People who are crushed by unjust systems. And you know, we're not just talking about people out there. If we're open to see it, we will find that this is the reality for people in England, in Crediton, in our villages, in our streets, in this room, in our families. And you know, just as in Egypt, oppression sometimes survives, not because everyone agrees with it, but just because it wasn't questioned. It becomes accepted. It stopped being noticed. And I think this passage in Exodus reminds us that God doesn't accept it, and so neither should we. We are called to see what others overlook. We are called to pay attention, to listen where others might rush past. We're called to act and to speak up where others might stay silent. We are called to be compassionate, to be generous, to be kind, to show hospitality, to advocate for others in need. For some of us, that might mean supporting the food bank. It might be noticing the neighbour who's struggling. It might be speaking up when someone else's voice gets dismissed. Maybe contacting our MP about an issue or joining with organisations who are doing good work. And maybe it's simply refusing to look away when we see someone in need. I remember one Sunday, a little while ago, not too long ago, and I was in the fish tank while the service was happening. And a lady came in from outside. She sort of looked a bit confused, looked around a little bit, and then turned to me and said, "Is Caroline here?" And Caroline Smith was actually stood here she was leading the service. So we were stood at the back and Caroline was stood here with a mic. So I was a little bit surprised that she hadn't seen her. And I was like, yeah, she's there, but she's a bit busy right now. She's leading the service. And then they just looked at me and said, "Not her, my Caroline. Is my Caroline here?" Now, some of you will know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to tell you her name or her story this morning. But she came and said, "Is my Caroline here?" And I've asked Caroline if I can tell you this story this morning. She said I could, so she's okay. Over a period of time, Caroline, Markley, there she is, looking very embarrassed. Caroline had chosen not to walk past that lady when she saw her in the high street. She'd chosen to pause sometimes and say hello, and to find out her name, and to find out a bit of her story. She'd chosen to invite her here, let her know there was a cup of coffee going every Sunday. And those things meant so much to that lady, and I don't know how she would have expressed it herself, right? But it meant enough for her to come to our church and ask for my Caroline. Is she here? Is my Caroline here? Now, Caroline's not fixed everything that lady might have needed or all the problems she might have been experiencing. But that's what God would do, right? He'd come down and act, to help, to do something. I think by doing those small things, seemingly small things, that lady found God's love and compassion in those interactions. Because God is the one who liberates and delivers, but he sends his people. He sends us. We are called to reflect his heart for justice and for mercy. And in Jesus Christ, we have a perfect example of one who came to this world to do just that, to liberate not just from slavery, but from sin, from fear, even from death. He saw those who were ignored. He spent time with those that other people preferred not to. He raised up those who were looked down upon. He confronted the powers that were crushing vulnerable people. He poured out grace and mercy and compassion over and over again. That is the God that we worship. And he still calls his people to be part of his work of deliverance. He calls us, me and you, to join with him. Not to individually save the world, not to individually fix all the problems. But my questions to you this morning were, the oppressed. Do you see them? Do you hear them? Do you know them? I think there's a challenge for us this morning about how we respond to that. The oppressed might be invisible in the world, but Exodus 3 tells us they are not invisible to God. He is calling us to see and to hear and respond with his compassion this morning. I'm going to pray. Loving and holy God, you are the one who sees suffering. You hear the cries of the oppressed. And you are the one who comes down to deliver. Lord, I pray for us this morning that you would open our eyes to those that we overlook. Would you soften our hearts around those that we might rush past? And Lord, I pray that you would give us the courage to respond as your people. Help us to show your love and compassion. And Lord, fill us with your strength. We trust that as you promised Moses, you promise us that you will be with us. Amen.